Because of all of the concerns around invasive species that we looked at in the last video, many methods have been developed to control or eradicate them. In general, invasive species control is built on 4 key priorities: the prevention of new invasions, the early detection of new invasives should that protection fail, a rapid response to new invaders, and the management of already established and spreading invasives. In this video, we will overview these 4 key priorities, as well as some of the tools that are used to control non-native invasive species. The most effective way to deal with an invasive species is to prevent it from getting established in a new environment in the first place. While prevention programs may be costly in the short term, in the long term they can be incredibly cost-effective, as they can help to avoid the significant long-term economic, environmental, and social costs that we looked at in the last video. This is why governments, including here in Canada, often have import regulations that help to catch potential invasive species. These programs include pre-border and border inspections and interceptions that aim to detect illegal introductions and detect unintentional introductions. This is obviously easier said than done. Think about how many planes, trains, trucks, and ships come into Canada every day, and each one is a potential vector for invasive species to enter into the country. It's obviously impossible to search each vehicle from top to bottom thoroughly, so prevention programs tend to focus on key commodities, pathways, and vectors, those that are deemed to be the most at risk. In Canada, some of the key pathways for invasive species that have been identified by the federal government are shown on the screen here. As you can see, there is a distinction made between those introductions that are intentional and those that are by accident. Intentional species introductions are generally heavily regulated industries and include things like aquariums and the rest of the pet trade, seeds and plants for agriculture and horticulture, and animals being transported for livestock or ranching purposes. In these cases, the arrivals are usually expected by the government, and there are screening and quarantine procedures in place to ensure that what is coming is what was expected, and that individuals are not carrying any unexpected diseases or potentially invasive hitchhikers. Unintentional introductions pose a tougher challenge for officials working on prevention because, well, they happen by accident. As I previously mentioned, it is impossible to check every piece of material coming into Canada, which is why if you've ever crossed the border, you might remember having to answer questions about whether or not you're carrying any plant or animal material. Of course, you might be selected for a random search anyway, but for the most part, these self-declaration forms are used to target where to look for potential invasive species with people who are crossing the border. In terms of industry, some are considered to be a bigger risk than others, and their shipments coming into the country tend to be screened more often than others. One example of this is exotic fruit, as in addition to bananas, it's not uncommon for shipments to also contain little hitchhikers like spiders and mosquitoes. Of course, these prevention systems are not perfect, and of course, sometimes invasive species will fall through the cracks and be introduced to new places. Robust monitoring programs are essential to detecting an invasive species early, which is important because the earlier a new population is detected, the more likely the efforts to control it will be successful. Integrated rapid response networks are required, and contingency plans and emergency funds for eradication measures are essential in order to eradicate, contain, or control invasive species as quickly as possible once they are detected. This is in order to avoid having them become established populations that can rapidly spread. Once an invasive species has become established in a new area, the strategy shifts to containment, control, and eradication. The goal is to stop it from spreading to new sites, stop the population from growing at its current site, and eventually eradicate it completely. There are a number of different tools and methods that can be used to contain, control, and eradicate invasive species, but they generally fall into one of 3 categories: mechanical control, chemical control, and biological control. Each of these types of methods has their own sets of positive and negatives, and different ones will be more effective on different species. In the end, an integrated strategy that draws on multiple methods from multiple categories is often found to be the most effective. Let's look at each of these categories in more detail and how and when they might be applied. First, let's look at mechanical methods to controlling and eradicating invasive species. Mechanical methods often involve the pulling up or mowing of an invasive plant population in order to limit seed production, or the trapping or shooting of invasive animals. Mechanical methods of control work well in areas that are easily accessible with easily navigable terrain. They can also be used in environmentally sensitive areas because they are targeted methods that pose minimal or no harm to other species in the community. When it comes to invasive plants, mechanical methods tend to work best on those that reproduce mainly through seed rather than through their roots and rhizomes. This is because it's very difficult to pull up the entire root system of many plants, and a number of invasive plants like toadflax often have extensive lateral root systems, and it only takes one very small piece of root being left in the soil for the plant to regrow. Mechanical control methods need to be carefully timed in order to prevent or minimize the spread of seeds. If a plant primarily spreads through seeds, then coming in and pulling it up or cutting it down doesn't do a lot to solve the larger problem if the plant has already gone to seed. So mechanical methods are typically used when the plant is large enough to be easily seen and identified, but early enough in the season that it hasn't gone to seed yet. There are of course some drawbacks and limitations to mechanical methods of control. The first is that they are labor intensive and not possible in all areas. For example, they tend to be difficult, if not impossible, on steep slopes or rocky, unstable terrain. Mechanical methods also tend to not to be a one-time only thing. They often need to be done multiple times over a season and multiple years in a row in order to completely exhaust the seed bank and the soil. With invasive animals, sometimes government agencies will engage with the sport hunting and fishing industries to help with their control and eradication. For example, in Texas, hunters can bag as many feral hogs as they'd like, and there's no season on hunting the rapidly expanding and predator-free species. In Ontario, if anglers happen to catch one of 8 prohibited invasive species, including the bighead and black carps, they are required by law to immediately destroy it so that it cannot reproduce or grow. Chemical methods of controlling and eradicating species include things like herbicide, which target certain plants or groups of plants, insecticides, which target insects, as well as other chemical agents that harm or kill animals like rodenticides, which target rats, mice, and other rodents. The use of chemical control methods can be contentious, and there are very real risks associated with their use. We touched on the potential human health implications of chemical control in an earlier video, but there are also environmental concerns, especially for the broader chemicals like glyphosate, which generally end up killing many more plants than just the invasive species that are the main target. Chemical controls are also generally not used on populations close to water bodies, as there's a risk that the chemicals could end up contaminating the water and creating a whole host of other environmental problems. These risks need to be taken into account, but there are benefits to using chemical methods that make them attractive. First, they tend to be more lethal than other methods, meaning that they can be more effective at getting towards a complete eradication. They also tend to be less labor-intensive than other methods, especially mechanical ones, meaning that it's possible to deal with a larger invasion in a shorter amount of time. Like all of the different types of methods that we will be looking at today, some species are better handled by chemical controls than others. Plants with thick, waxy, or hairy leaves tend not to be able to absorb enough of the chemical in order to be killed, so these methods are generally better suited for plants without these characteristics. They also tend to be the most effective on plants that are in an active growth stage, when it's a seedling, budding, or an early flower. So just like we discussed with mechanical controls, timing chemical applications properly is essential to success. Chemical controls may also be used on invasive animals. For example, rats have been eradicated from the island of South Georgia through an effort that took 7 years and was primarily done through chemical control methods, mainly through poison bat traps which were set by researchers by hand in the easy-to-reach parts of the island and dropped by helicopter in the tougher-to-reach areas, which is what's pictured here. The last type of invasive species control that we will look at today are biological controls. Biological control is the use of living organisms to control or eradicate an invasive species. For example, many of the invasive plants that we deal with here in North America come from Europe or Asia, where there is an insect or disease that keeps their population in check. But here we are lacking this control, which is at least in part of the reason why they become invasive. Remember that one of the key features of an invasive species is that they are lacking a natural predator. So the idea behind biological control is that by introducing their natural predator, we'll be able to get their population under control and create a system more like their native habitat. If this idea is raising a lot of red flags to you, you're certainly not alone. Many conservationists have raised something ranging from concern to outright outrage over the idea. And these concerns are not necessarily unwarranted, given the history of how the method has worked in the past. For example, in Australia, cane toads were introduced in 1935 in an attempt to control the grey-backed cane beetle and the French's beetle, both of which are detrimental to sugarcane crops, an important agricultural crop in Australia. The original 102 cane toads that were brought to the country from Hawaii were bred in captivity for a couple of years before some 62,000 toadlets were released in the major sugarcane producing areas of northern Queensland. Their spread was slow at first, but as you can see from the animation here, by the 1980s they had spread throughout most of the state. By 2009, they had reached all the way to the Western Australian border and as far south as Sydney. So clearly the cane toads have adapted well to their new environment. But how have the beetle species they were meant to control fared? Well, the cane toads barely touched them, choosing instead to feast on other insects available in their new home. But not only did the introduction of cane toads not solve the problem they were brought in to solve, they also have a poison gland on their neck, which has created a whole host of new problems, as pretty much any animal that eats them ends up dead. Cane toads have been linked to population declines in a number of native species, including the northern quoll and the saltwater crocodile. Cane toads are usually held up as an example of why biocontrol shouldn't be used, but it's important to note that there are examples of where it has been successful. To stick with Australia, prickly pear is a plant that was introduced in the late 1770s and became invasive in New South Wales and Queensland. In 1926, the prickly pear moth, which only feeds on the prickly pear in their home range of the Americas, was introduced. In this case, the biocontrol was successful almost overnight. The moths immediately began to feed on their familiar food, and to this day, they are still the main mechanism of control for prickly pear populations in Australia, and they haven't branched out to munching on other native plants. However, despite these successes, the legacy of the cane toad and the general stance of being against playing God still stands, and many conservationists remain firmly against the practice, so biological control methods can be a bit of a tough sell. With all of the methods that we just looked at, mechanical, chemical, and biological, it is important to consider what happens to a site after the invasive species treatment is applied. One big step that is important to consider is restoration and recovery to give native ecosystems a boost and to help ensure they are simply not reinvaded. The process of invasive species removal often disturbs a lot of ground, and as we learned in a previous video, this makes an area particularly vulnerable to new invasions. This brings us back to our first key priority in invasive species management, prevention. But in this case, we aren't trying to stop a species at the border, we're trying to stop a species that is already present from spreading and recolonizing an area. This often involves the public and educational campaigns. For example, you may be familiar with the practice of not moving firewood, and to buy it or find it where you plan on burning it. In Canada, this is actually mandated by law through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which also handles a lot of invasive species management. This is because transporting firewood can also result in transporting invasive species like the Asian longhorn beetle and emerald ash borer. Similarly, boaters are encouraged to clean the bottom and sides of their boat before taking it to a new body of water in order to prevent the spread of invasives. Similar campaigns also encourage hikers and anglers to clean their gear after coming home,